Cineboys to Cinemen, episode 57.
57.
Hope you're well, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. This week, after yet another short hiatus, we're going to be talking about MaXXXine.
Yep.
Ty West's conclusion to his...
I think it's X Trilogy, is it? I'm fairly sure that's what he's calling it, yeah, because it's sort of an X motif throughout all three, in a way.
Yeah, I agree with
Even
that.
Pearl, there's a lot of X's in Pearl. So, yeah.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah. So we'll have a good old natter about the movie, the typically sort of incisive commentary you've come to expect from Cineboys to Cinema.
Certainly, yes.
We'll talk about his previous two works, Ty West as a sort of horror filmmaker, the genre more broadly, because I think with his films essentially being love letters to very specific eras of horror history, I think it's sort of makes sense to talk about them. And of course the culture in which the film sits in, which is the 1980s.
Yeah.
I believe you also wanted to talk about fame as well, or portrayals of fame in cinema.
Yeah, just briefly kind of touch on that, because it's an interesting portrayal of fame, I think, and what it can do to human beings, and the sort of the need for it, and then arriving at it, and what that can do to someone. I think there's a through line in all three of these films which are concerned with the acquisition of it and the kind of yearning for it. So especially with Pearl, actually. Just talk about that briefly.
Absolutely. And the sort of darker elements of Tinseltown. Yeah. Because I think a lot of people, see Hollywood as this sort of place of dreams and creativity, but there's a real dark, seedy underbelly that obviously a lot of films have sort of exposed. And I think MaXXXine attempts to do the same. But we'll talk about that later on.
Nice.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Questing the cinematic void. All right then, Ben. Fame in cinema. Thrust your hips at me.
Oof, all right. So, I think what X attempts to do with it, this is Ty West's, it's the first in the trilogy. It's obviously, you start with MaXXXine, the character, and she is kind of yearning to be she's a reasonably up-and-coming player in the adult entertainment industry, and it's very kind of low-key what they're doing at this point, but she's got ambition, hasn't she, to become like a star, however that...
It's ambition for fame, isn't it?
Yeah,
irrespective of anything else, and I think while she's undoubtedly talented, I think it is... That sort of talent is driven more by... a desire just to be famous, more than being like a respected artist, or
it's kind of spreading your personality around the world.
Yeah,
that's her thing, and it reminded me a lot of Mulholland Drive in the beginning of that, of just like that kind of yearning. Right, Naomi Watts are kind of, MaXXXine's a lot less sort of airheaded than Naomi Watts' character in Mulholland Drive.
Yeah, the opening of Mulholland Drive is so sort of like ethereal, isn't it?
Yeah,
she obviously after the opening sequence at night time with the car crash, but it's
that escalator.
The escalator scene. Yeah, that's it. And she's chatting to that old elderly couple.
Yeah,
and it's just like
it's almost like she's arrived in paradise.
Yeah.
The way she's acting
perfectly sort of encapsulate the fantasy that I think those in the sort of upper echelons of Hollywood would want to sort of be the sort of dominant image to outsiders of the sort of inner workings of the city and the sort of industry that has given it its fame. Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting point.
It's just like, I think that all three films have a sort of through line, especially Pearl. And what I think Pearl, and we'll probably talk about this more later, but Pearl sort of retroactively enriches X with more context, which is such a clever move, I think. As most all prequels should do this, and a lot of them kind of fail to, because it's more of like referential. But Pearl is just like following a character who, by the time we arrive at X's storyline, is just a sort of demented monster almost, but not without nuance, and a kind of, it is clear to like when you watch it that she's yearning for youth again, and she's yearning for that feeling that of kind of what having your whole life ahead of you, but then to see that happen to that character in Pearl, I think, and to see how upset she gets when she doesn't get that dance audition, and just like, it's like definitely commenting on that kind of humanity's sort of capacity to leer at people and laugh at people with those ambitions as well. Like
a sort of culture that has certainly in more recent times has become huge on that basis.
Yeah. I'm thinking all the way back to like Pop Idol and X Factor, like with the like the thing that people used to laugh at was the auditions of these sort of delusional but well-meaning people coming in and singing, and obviously they chop all the average ones, and you get all the you kind of left with a lot of troubled people who just want to put themselves out there, and it's just a bit sad. Mm-hmm. And Pearl reminded me of that in some aspects of this.
Yeah, I can see the connection. Yeah,
there's a kind of delusion about Pearl who you get acquainted with the family circumstances, and it's all through the lens of this sort of 1918 kind of acting style, which is really interesting. But I just thought like it reminded me of Mulholland Drive and things like the Truman Show about being, what the Truman Show kind of does is how do you act when you don't think you're being watched? And Pearl's sort of the opposite, which is like when you watch her, you feel like she is performing for you. It's really weird. Like she's permanently, even when she's on her own, she's kind of like her performance is like very theatrical and very kind of like she knows that you're watching her.
There's almost like an overbearingly saccharine element to her performance, isn't there?
Yeah,
it's sort of like reminiscent of like people like Judy Garland.
Yes, exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the sort of characters that they would have been forced to play. Obviously, Pearl is set during an era before Wizard of Oz, but there's that sort of idea about the leading lady and being this sort of this exuberant ball of sort of happy energy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
which, as we know, in certainly the case of Judy Garland, was starkly contrasted with her real life.
Also, Shelley Duvall as well. I know Shelley Duvall was like
R.I.P.
Yeah, exactly. She was prominent much later on than this era, but Mia Goth has gone on record saying she's one of her favourite actors.
Yeah,
Shelley Duvall. And you can see that in her performance. That kind of that energy, like you were saying.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mention Shelley Duvall, not only obviously because of her tragic recent passing, but as a reference point for Mia Goth, it is quite obvious that she's, obviously it's one of those things where she needed to say it before it became obvious, but you can really see the sort of parallels in their performances. That sort of there's something quietly unhinged to them, but it's something that's in response to their sort of like a trauma and how that trauma is impacting the way they perceive like love, connections, or in Pearl's case, fame. In Robert Altman's Three Women, she is just someone that wants to be loved, and that sort of desire makes her vulnerable, and easily sort of picked apart by sort of the kind of men that prey on that, And it's interesting that she would reference Duvall's acting style as an influence because definite.
You can see it, can't you?
Similarities.
I'm thinking again with the Shining. She does it in The Shining as well. That kind of the smiley
housewife sort of holding everything together, an abusive husband.
She's sort of fronting her emotions with this mask of an all-American kind of happy clappy, I'll make everything for you, I exist for you kind of persona. And it isn't real, and it's not real. And like when you watch Pearl and the way she interacts with her parents as the film goes on, and how the cracks start to show, and how she basically kind of goes through a sort of coming of age crisis amidst a very pandemic-y movie. Like there's a Spanish flu thing in there, and
because that was a huge thing, wasn't it? It killed millions of people after
more people than World War One.
It's crazy.
20 million, I think. It's mental.
Imagine surviving the war than dying of that.
I'd be so gutting. I
know.
Coming home,
so
being
annoyed.
Really?
This.
But it makes me want to watch X again, which I think is its intention. I think.
Let's have a little chat about X.
I
mean, I'm sort of chomping at the bit because I love X. Obviously, my love for sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and 70s era horror movies is well documented on this podcast. So sort of any excuse to sort of dredge it up and bore you with my opinions on it once again. I honestly X was a real surprise for me. I actually missed it when it released, and I remember seeing like it sort of just came up on like YouTube, I think, like a sort of analysis of the film. I watched it and I was like, fucking hell, this film's completely gone under my radar. And then before I got to the spoiler territory, I stopped it and immediately bought it.
Oh, nice.
And I just love it. I honestly think it's one of the best sort of more modern horror films I've seen in such a long time.
No.
And the reason I think it's so good is because obviously it's a homage to Tobe Hooper, the early Wes Cravens.
Yeah.
This sort of taking the horror from the mythology of like Mary Shelley and sort of gothic horror and planting it in America's sort of backyard. But there's a sort of ambiguity in the way that he handles his reverence for that period.
Yes.
It's not overt. The conventions of the sort of 70s slasher are absolutely there and almost followed to the letter. But because of that reserved and more ambiguous approach to his influences, like it was just done so well. Like the whole thing felt like a real. It could stand on its own 2 feet as its own film, but also for losers like us, it was like because he did such a good job of like sort of almost relegating the sort of cultural schisms of the 70s to almost to the background. But then slowly drip feeding them into the central narrative, because it is essentially a story about old versus young.
And
completely. How perceptions from both sides are sort of kind of ill-founded. The way that the youth perceive the old as these sort of like regressive, sexless, sort of dull, creepy,
on a kind of production line to nowhere. Kind of thing, right? Like the demise is shortly.
Exactly,
it's going to be soon, so they're not relevant to society anymore.
And all of their sort of like, anger towards the sort of free love hippie movement is sort of completely unfounded, and and I really like the way West plays with that, in the sense that I think you mentioned it before, but with Pearl's character in X, she's someone that actually longs to be young again, longs to be youthful, longs to be
relevant, right?
Be beautiful in her own eyes, and I thought that was such a really fascinating way to play with those sort of cultural schisms at the time. But it was done in such a sort of, again, like a really subtle, ambiguous way. Because MaXXXine is very much the same. It sort of sets its stall out in terms of the genre, the time period, and then it sort of not in the same way that X does, but it sort of thrusts those sort of themes into the central narrative. But to me, it didn't do it in anywhere near enough an effective way to be an effective homage. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But no, I just think X is a fantastic example of like a homage done right, because there's so much, we talk about this a lot, nostalgia in culture and a reverence for times gone by. But it can be done properly. I'm not saying that I don't want to see it, because obviously so much of culture is a variation of something that's been done before. But to obviously have a reverence for a particular genre in a particular time, and to handle it with such grace, I think is a real achievement in this current cultural landscape.
I agree. I think it does the same thing that, this is a weird comparison, but like Back to the Future does, by forcing you to think that people who are 30 years older than you once had the same kind of drive, wants, needs, desires as like a 20-year-old.
And the same battles.
Yeah, exactly. And and how obviously like age can change you, and things like becoming a parent and becoming kind of embedded in your a kind of in a sort of into the society that you might at one point have resisted, and yet those feelings from and yearning for the past will absolutely still be there. They might not just be at the forefront, especially to the youth of that day. It's the same kind of idea, and that's why I loved watching Pearl, because it kind of cements that. I think, seeing her that young, you're just like, oh, you just want to be that. You want to do it all again, don't you?
Yeah, it's like an act of rebellion, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, particularly in the context of X, in the sense that obviously it's against the backdrop of the, the sort of the embers of the free love movement and hippie culture, which obviously was one of the most seismic moments of sort of collective youthful rebellion in history.
Yeah.
So I think there's probably a reason why that sort of cultural shift has given perhaps more credence than a lot of the sort of generational battles that happen with each passing or generation, I guess. But yeah, I absolutely adored the film. I thought the way the death sequences are fantastic.
Yeah, they are.
They're really in the spirit of the sort of like real sort of grim nature of 70s slashers. It really channeled that energy of like, this is like taking horror to brand new territory, because that's what 70s horror movies were, like it was, moving away from like haunted houses and vampires and going out into like the American West with a crappy camera with battered film stock and making these sort of crafting these sort of nightmarish mythologies, or making a film about dreams. With Nightmare on Elm Street, like I'm just thinking, that's such. I know now it's kind of an obvious thing to potentially like make a film about, but at the time that's quite a groundbreaking idea. Is just like you're never safe from that. The only way you can be safe from the antagonist is by being awake, which can't happen forever. It's the same kind of in that same spirit, I think. Yeah, I mean, of course, I think sort of. That would lend itself more to MaXXXine, wouldn't it? Because it's a bit closer to that time. But I completely agree. But like I feel like, and that's what's so interesting about Ty West as a filmmaker is that he's made films before, but this trilogy is what's really put him on the map, really. And it's so interesting to see someone doing it with such reverence for sort of other
other sort of 70s and 80s slashers. Not just slashers, but horror films in general. And you could kind of compare it to Cabin in the Woods in that is also like heavy homage, but it takes it in such a different direction, a lot more grounded and subtle approach of paying homage to those kinds of films, sort of Evil Dead and I think I liked Cabin in the Woods, but I remember seeing it and thinking, oh, that's like reasonably clever. The third act sort of lost it a bit, but then X was like more crystal.
Stuck the landing. Like,
yeah.
You're right. Like, in these kinds of movies, the third act's where things start to unravel. MaXXXine. Like from start to finish. I mean, I'm just waxing lyrical about it, but I just can't compliment it enough as an effective homage and as just a movie on its own. It does exactly what it sets out to do. It doesn't beat you over the head with sort of, subtext. The subtext is there, and that's the thing about like those kinds of movies. It's like it is about the experience first.
Yes,
the subtext comes second. Should you choose to accept that, And
I
think that's the beauty of X.
And
to perhaps a slightly lesser extent for me, Pearl. Even though I really liked Pearl a lot.
Yeah, I think Pearl is more confident than the other two films. I don't know why. I've found it sort of bold, very, very colourful, and sort of aesthetic homages to a period that is long been forgotten, right up until the pandemic, when people started thinking, oh, when was the last time we had a pandemic? It was right after World War One. Like the 20s have been explored thoroughly, but I guess you call them the 10s. Like you rarely hear about them.
Post World War One is not like a sort of era that has had a lot. It's not a sort of well trodden ground, certainly in cinema.
And like the way they kind of approached it as well, like they weren't heavy handed with things like film grain or kind of aspect ratio and like a lot of soundtracks and stuff. A lot of people will cue you into an era via things like music. Actually, I think MaXXXine is guilty of that. But Pearl is different in that, like, the titles are very kind of 1918, but the aesthetic and the kind of and the simplistic story isn't at all. It's like weirdly modern. It's like they were trying to emulate how it would actually be, as opposed to like how we perceive it.
It's almost the way she acts, and we sort of talked about the sort of Judy Garland parallels, but it sort of makes me think like. it was a time where you were far more susceptible to be swept up by the magic of the motion picture.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
Completely, yeah.
And I know, obviously, the film industry didn't really kick on till the 20s, but the idea of this dream, it really fuses with the spectacle of this sort of fledgling medium.
Yeah.
When it would have had like this all-consuming power in a way that it obviously doesn't now, because we're saturated with
we're a lot more active as audience members now as to how things are made, but back then it would have been like a magic trick.
There'd be so much mystique around it that is obviously sort of pretty much dead now. But
I think it's I thought Pearl was really it was like a breath of fresh air in a lot of respects, and it had a respect for its source material would have been the first film. But
it's a bold choice.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
I think you're right in saying it's the sort of boldest film on that basis.
I think it's less successful in the content, in the kills and things like that. Like you say, I think...
It's a 15.
Is it? Okay.
The other two were 18s.
Yeah, hard R's. Yeah, I imagine. This is more... It's more about youth than the other two, in that it kind of takes that aspect of it, and fame as well. It kind of takes a front seat. Whereas the other two have more of a macabre sensibility.
It sort of reminded me of like a James Dean vehicle at times. You know what I mean? Again, sort of Nicholas Ray films with James Dean. That's sort of late 50s, isn't it? Or late
50s. Yeah, it's only two of them, isn't it?
Yeah,
two James Dean movies. Yeah,
but or at least two where he was the star.
I think so. Yeah.
But I mean, like that sort of similar energy, that sort of youthful rebellion, but obviously through the lens of that period. It sort of looks comparably tame to like the sort of new Hollywood of the 70s. All that kind of stuff.
It is
equally as relevant and equally as important.
Yeah, completely. I think it is a pandemic film. Like, it's clearly written as a response to it.
I'd never thought of it that way.
It's sort of because the Spanish flu thing is that the idea is like Pearl can't interact with anyone, and she meets the projectionist, played by David Corenswet, future Superman.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
He looks exactly like Henry Cavill. Anyway, it is, and it has that charm to it as well, the kind of slicked back hair, and and the soldiers coming back from the war and everything,
and again in a sort of, to continue the sort of parallel with Duvall characters, she's her optimism makes her vulnerable to someone like him who's just wants to get his leg over, and
that's it.
Then he sort of quickly realizes that she's obviously not, her obsession with fame is bordering on mental instability.
Yeah, exactly.
And, he wants to get out, and then obviously in that brilliant scene he gets a pitchfork in the back.
That's one of the best moments, and the aftermath to that when her like sister-in-law comes around.
That's a great scene.
That unbroken take of her just basically spewing out, like being honest for the first time. And letting that front go, and really, really impressive.
Great scene. Mia Goth's favourite in the whole trilogy.
Really?
Yeah, in terms of the kills. Yeah, she's been asked that a few times.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, I imagine she's quite hot on the circuit at the moment, doing the kind of...
the press for it.
Press and stuff.
Yeah.
Trying to...
I mean, she's excellent in all three of the films. Sort of keep alluding to her sort of somewhat negative opinions about MaXXXine, but, she is still superb in that, even if I had problems with other areas of the movie.
It's not her fault at all. I think it's down to the construction. But it's
Pearl. She's probably at her best in Pearl, actually.
Yeah, she really owns it.
Real platform, isn't it? Whereas the other films have got a lot around it and other characters, and whereas it's a real sort of individual performance that drives Pearl, isn't it?
Yeah, it's you're very much with her. And everyone else around her is sort of largely irrelevant. Like their actions don't really have a bearing on her tremendously. I think it's quite interesting that her parents were German immigrants. Yeah, I think that was a kind of interesting take on. Like, I suppose that would have happened. During the First World War, that would have been quite an awkward place to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of that. Even in like the Second World War, like Japanese Americans were treated terribly.
Yeah, I imagine camps long after the war as well.
Yeah, they're put in camps during the war.
Fucking
in America. Yeah, I think America has obviously because it's a country that's founded by, you know, people from all over the world, obviously mostly Europeans at that time.
Yeah.
You know, it's obviously going to have a lot of people that obviously come from the same country as sort of enemies at that time.
Of course, yeah.
Which actually, I forgot that detail. So it does play into the narrative a little bit, doesn't it? The sort of animosity from the community towards that family.
Yes. I feel like Pearl is a lot more kind of eager to mix in with the culture that she's surrounded by, whereas obviously her parents, especially after the war, probably feeling a great deal of heat from that community.
Yeah, maybe a bit of resentment too.
Yeah, completely, yeah.
And I seem to remember that being a thing.
Yeah, it is definitely. It's definitely a kind of. It's not just a throwaway choice. There's definitely a reason. It kind of justifies their behaviour ever so slightly. Their kind of oppressive behaviour towards their child, in that they kind of want to keep her boxed in and they want to sort of snuff out any ambition that she has about absorbing herself into
a culture that is, you know, the sort of the enemy of their homeland.
Yeah, an emerging one as well. Like, and again, it still kind of harks back to that theme of old and young. And it's a very tried and tested thing about like being young and want to break away from your parents, and your parents being this kind of oppressive force. But it's more complicated than that. Obviously, you see,
it's given additional complexity by the sort of seismic sort of geopolitical shifts or socio-cultural shifts in each film. You've obviously got the sort of, as you say, the rapid rise of America. Obviously the Great Depression would come along and smash that. But, you know it was a country that was starting to sort of grow into the sort of the powerhouse that it is today. The allure of that culture has swept Pearl up.
It's very pro-capitalist. Pearl is very kind of good example of a capitalist, like an early capitalist, I suppose, wouldn't she? Of the kind of their sort of gold rushy type feeling of the sort of singular vision of yourself and how
which is what America's really built on, isn't it? The singular vision of the dream, and you know, you can achieve it if you go for it hard enough, and
if you push against
and kill a few people with a pitchfork.
That's it.
Interesting.
I need to rewatch X, I think, because it's been a while. It's been about a year and a half since I've seen it. I think I remember the alligator plays a part in X, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And there's a very kind of surprising sort of sexual encounter in it, which is shown in
again. That's just
detail.
a fucking brilliant bit of sort of thematic work by West. I think, like, you know, it's a scene that I think from MaXXXine's perspective is quite grim. But there's a strange sort of odd beauty to it. You know, that I really didn't expect to feel, given the sort of the narrative trajectory of the film, and obviously the, you know, but it's giving beauty to something that has often been deprived of that. You know? Again, from the perspective of the youth. You know,
completely.
who sort of, you know, who grimace at the sort of sight of affection being shared between anyone that isn't sort of their age. You know? So it is interesting in terms of like viewing that through those lenses, and you know, this idea of sexual freedom and liberation, but only to a certain point. You know, so it almost shows the limitations of this allegedly free. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm fascinated by that era, and I think it's a really, you know, cool period of history without sounding like too much of a loser. But you know, it's interesting that it probes questions about the limitations of that movement and the way they perceive these people, these sort of backward hicks, basically. Which again is a classic sort of 70s horror movie narrative trope.
Like Deliverance, Last House on the Left,
exactly,
kind of thing. And to be able to explore them as like three-dimensional characters is like, really unexpected.
I mean, they obviously are still fucking maniacs that kill lots of people, but you know,
but again, that's like where Pearl comes in for me. It doesn't justify their behaviour, but it really does explain it. Completely explains it, and her husband as well, because her husband at the end of Pearl comes home.
And
like, she's he's like, "What the fuck have you done?" And she just looks at him, like, and the credits roll over her face, just like maniacally. She's kind of on the verge of tears, but she's smiling at him. And you can totally see why they did the things they did in X as a result of the end of, you know, what happens in Pearl. It's just like
it creates a sort of. You know, we talk about this a lot in the context of horror movies, but they sort of create their own morality. And in that context, it sort of does work. Through the sort of, again, what West has created and gone back and then gone forward again.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
It's been about maybe 2 years since I last watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first one. Weirdly, saw the second one really recently.
Oh, excellent!
It's a great film.
Yeah, the second one's great. Yeah,
thematically very, very different.
It's the perfect sequel. I think we might have said this quite a lot.
Oh yeah. We've mentioned it a few times.
I always go back to that sort of analogy from my conversation with James Cameron. The interview that I've seen with James Cameron. When he was offered the chance to make the sequel to Alien, he was like, "Well, I can't fucking make Alien. It's impossible to make Alien again. Why would I even try?
Yeah,
but I can make action movies.
Yeah,
play
to my strengths.
And obviously, Alien is definitely still the better movie, but Aliens stands on its own as a sort of more than credible sequel with some which is in many ways,
I think, superior in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to compare them on a sort of like for like basis, other than obviously they share the same world and characters, and obviously the central arc of Ripley.
Yeah,
but obviously the first one is like a landmark moment in sci-fi and horror.
Yeah,
in equal measure.
Completely,
when sort of Ridley Scott was firing all cylinders.
And
obviously of atmosphere and tension and invention, whereas Aliens, it continues the mythology in a way that doesn't attempt to redo what has already happened. And I think that's why Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, also directed by Tobe Hooper, is such a fucking great sequel, because it just doesn't take it. It's still got that sort of grotty grubbiness, but it's just
it's like a theme park.
It explores the mythology of the family, and it's sort of goofy, and it's sort of like pure canon. But there's some real artistry to it still, and
I was going to ask you, with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, do you think there's a sort of semblance almost of the little bit like X? There's a focus not only on the main characters, the central characters, but also the antagonists, and then kind of injecting them with a tiny bit of, I wouldn't say morality, but injecting them with a bit of three-dimensional. There's just a sort of subtle hint of it.
Yeah, I definitely think X does that a lot better than Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I don't think Texas Chainsaw Massacre necessarily needs to do it too much.
No, yeah.
Because you're right in saying it is more about this collection of young individuals. But yeah, no, I do think there is something about Leatherface that he isn't just, sort of, like you say, one-dimensional antagonist. I think there is something quite childlike about him,
and that is explored a lot further in the sort of sequels and stuff, isn't it?
Yeah,
because it isn't, the iconography of those films isn't the main characters of the first one at all.
No,
it's all about the villain, and I think that's interesting, that how it's not. And the same with like Freddy Krueger as well, like the actual main cast, as it like the build cast, apart from Heather Langenkamp, are recycled because the franchise isn't propped up by the main characters; it's propped up by the antagonist. And I just wondered what you thought of Texas Chainsaw in that context, really.
Yeah, it's interesting more with him because he doesn't, like, Freddy Krueger has a lot more dialogue. And there's a lot more sort of, as the films go on, an attempt to sort of mine the mythology of Krueger, isn't there? Which starts off pretty good and then just obviously gets worse. But
oh man, yeah.
But it's interesting in the case of Leatherface. Yes, it is sort of explored, but maybe his strength is that he doesn't really give a lot away. There is a sort of an element. It's the same thing with Alien. It's a weird parallel, but the fact that there isn't much given away generates a sense of tension in the narrative, but also it allows you as an audience member to sort of impose your own view and your own feeling, or maybe just not have a feeling at all. Like it is just about this singular moment, and I think even though Leatherface, there is a sort of like childlike wonderment to his character, which is sort of offset by his obvious complete lack of morals. It gives the film a sort of grubbier edge, a sort of more sickening feel. I mean, that film is just sickening. I mean, the violence in the film, obviously by today's standards, is pretty sort of tame, but it's more the feel of the film, the soundtrack, and the sort of, again, that sort of orangey, browny sort of film stock. Even the sort of sweltering sort of libidos of all of the young people. There's everything about it is very claustrophobic and grubby. And, I don't know.
It is, yeah.
But no, that's an interesting point. The idea that so many of these, particularly sort of 70s, 80s horror movies, are sort of driven more by the antagonist than any of the sort of...
Yeah, it's not about it. You're not really relying on heroes at all. You're relying on the actions of the person who's meant to be, in a conventional sense, hindering the arc of the main characters, and it's actually the complete opposite. You want to spend time with them. You don't want to spend time with the sort of sweaty teenagers in the back of a van exploring this kind of like dilapidated building. It's all about the villain.
A lot of them with masks as well.
Yeah, a lot of masks.
Jason. No, sorry. Yeah.
Jason,
sorry.
yeah. Freddy Krueger's got his hat, which could be seen, there's an iconography there.
Yeah.
Last House on the Left, I can't remember. Did they have a mask?
Oh, I can't remember. Mike Myers.
Yeah, obviously.
Michael Myers.
Couldn't not mention Michael Myers, yeah. Or Mike Myers, yeah. Austin Powers, yeah. I mean, he didn't have a mask, but he had glasses.
True.
Yeah. Yeah. I need to see Texas Chainsaw 1 again. I remember the last shot being probably the best shot in the entire film, of him just swinging that chainsaw around.
It's
blindly.
one of the best shots of all time, I think.
Yeah, and the hard cut to black as well.
Yeah,
it's quite revolutionary for the 70s.
Yeah, I just fucking God, it's just for me. It doesn't get better than that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
We played the video game in here not too long ago.
Yeah, pretty good.
Not too bad. Yeah, I enjoy
it.
It's that tension.
Pretty decent. It's made by quite a small studio.
Yeah.
Nottingham, I believe.
Oh, really? Where's speaking of which, where's Mia Goth from? She's English. She's from
I have no idea where she's from. Yeah.
She's in interviews. I was like, you from sort of East Riding or something? I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea where she's from.
She's definitely from the UK. That's for sure.
She's from London.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
The way she talks seems slightly odd, slightly difficult to place her.
Yeah,
accent.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, always nice to see in England. Someone from England doing a convincing American accent.
Yeah, superb, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't have guessed. She could have been from the US, absolutely.
Yeah,
in all three of those films.
Fantastic actress. She's definitely someone that really sort of cultivated a space as this, actor that's, really unafraid of the challenging projects. She's Nymphomaniac.
Oh God, yeah.
I
quite liked that film. It's a two-parter.
I need to rewatch them, but I don't remember disliking them.
That's where she met Shia LaBeouf, I think.
Oh, okay.
They're still together to this day.
Are they still together?
Yeah.
There we go. Bit of celeb gossip there.
Yeah. That's presumably why you're tuning in.
You're waiting for that, and you think, God, all this fucking shit about Texas Chainsaw Massacre and aliens. Yeah. Get me to the celeb goss.
Yeah.
These boys have obviously got their fingers on the pulse.
They read Heat.
Yeah.
She is fantastic. She's really, really. She subverts that. I think there's a tendency with actors of her stature to kind of inhabit slightly mousy roles and maybe supporting roles of the kind of the gossipy friend or something who. In a horror film, especially a horror film in the 70s, will get killed off in the first maybe 45 minutes. But she's subverted that, I think. She's really, she plays a lead incredibly well, incredibly convincingly.
Yeah, she gives an edge, doesn't she, to the sort of the feminine archetype? Because obviously in horror movies, the sort of, you think about slasher films or the giallo films, particularly giallo films, they tend to feature a lot of sort of irreverent sleaze, and the sort of mutilation of the female form, often explicit sort of nudity, and sexual violence. And I mentioned giallo particularly because in the context of MaXXXine, it's such a huge visual touchstone, I think, for West, particularly in the villain styling of the villain.
Oh yeah.
But it's interesting to see that sort of played with, because there's a sort of obviously a tendency now for Hollywood to go badass women, fine, but that in itself is problematic because it's decided by committee. There's no sort of obviously there are plenty of good examples of that, of course.
Oh yeah.
But
Going all the way back to Ripley.
Well, yeah, lead back to Alien, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But, there is just something that feels like, again, decided in a boardroom, know, and as soon as it has that feel, it sort of loses that sort of, that genuine edge. But what I quite like about Goth's portrayal of that, and obviously West's sort of subtle sort of shift of that, is, there is that unhinged element to her character.
Yes.
And which, if anyone gets in the way of her achieving this sort of ascent to stardom, the sort of grotesque violence tends to ensue.
Yeah.
And the film is very sort of, the three films, particularly I thought X and MaXXXine, handle that quite interestingly.
Yeah.
It puts her in situations where the violence is seemingly the only way to sort of respond to the situation.
Yeah.
But there's the sort of the excessive nature of it suggests a mental instability.
Yes.
And I don't know what you think about that, but in the context of the way, obviously there's so much that's been written about the sort of role women play in horror films, particularly. Because they tend to be the sort of object of a lot of the sort of
the whole final girl thing as well.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously the sort of 70s and 80s there were a few examples. You have to think like Halloween with Jamie Lee Curtis,
absolutely.
People that sort of shined through it almost. I wonder what your take is on that in regards to Mia Goth's portrayal of that.
Yeah, I mean, for a start, I feel it's just nice to see, and nice is a strange word to use, but it's nice to see quite a deeply flawed character convincingly be a lead, and it does invite you to follow her and kind of be with her and root for her to these horrible things, to these people, not just men either, like anyone. Like you say, anyone that gets in her way, you sort of want her to become famous, but you realise when you see the violence and the kind of things she's capable of, and how she quite readily lets herself go and lets herself kind of just become a bit of a monster. You sort of realise in those moments that like you're not following someone who's all good. They're not omnipotent or anything. Like they are like deeply flawed. And I really admired that. I actually admired that in MaXXXine as well. And there's that line that kind of echoes through the whole trilogy, which is "I will not accept a life I do not deserve."
Yeah.
And they don't quite pull it off at the end of MaXXXine, but there was an interesting idea brought forward. There was that could mean anything. Like that could mean something really positive. Like that could be you pepping yourself up for a brighter life. But equally, it could be you realizing the error of your ways as well. It's really refreshing to see a character of that, like just so sort of broken, and you can tell when she's operating on a more kind of sort of a human level, and then when it kind of peaks and troughs throughout as well. I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, like her behaviour obviously makes sense in the context of the sort of mythology of the trilogy, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And that's what's so central to horror movies, is that things feel contained within the sort of rules that they've created. Yeah, I always find it sort of pretty reductive, not necessarily to sort of view horror films in a broader cultural context, particularly when it comes to discussions around femininity and portrayals of. Certainly sort of violence against women in film. I think that's obviously a very valid area of scholarly endeavour. But I mean more in the context of when people go, I wouldn't do that. Like narratively, I just think, well, there's no fucking point judging a horror movie on those. Unless the horror film was explicit in being like realistic, which most of them aren't.
No, God,
I just always think that's a really strange attitude to have towards the viewing of the horror experience, because horror, more than a lot of other genres, depends on that suspension of disbelief for you to be scared.
Yeah. It might
obviously it will touch on real things.
Yeah.
And there'll be an element of sort of some sense of realism to some of the horror movies you might watch, but I always think it's quite a reductive attitude to your enjoyment to view it. Although there is obviously quite a lot of fun having those kind of jokes as well.
Yeah, just the classic. I mean, Scream does a good job of poking fun at those kinds of tropes.
Yeah.
Why would you run upstairs, kind of thing? Or why don't you just ring the police, kind of thing? And from those sort of screenwriting holes you write yourself into are born cliches, right? So, your phone's broken, like the door's locked or something, that kind of stuff.
But that's obviously part of the fun of it, isn't it? And so maybe it's not necessarily reductive, but I find it more annoying, I guess, when people use it as like a genuine criticism. That frustrates them about a certain horror movie.
Yeah.
I just think, well,
there's instances. There's definitely like instances of MaXXXine basically getting thrust into a situation in which it is imperative for her to use self-defense, right? But instead of just using it like most kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of horror heroines would use, she takes a lot of comfort and kind of glee in enacting this violence, especially in MaXXXine. I'm thinking specifically of the bollock stomping scene.
Spoiler.
Yeah. Like she sort of.
That's probably the most violent bit in the whole movie.
Oh man, there's something about that. I don't know.
That's just from our perspective, but
being men.
Men. Sort of vague approximations of men.
Yeah.
That is an interesting point.
Yeah, she's like, right, I guess I have to do this, otherwise I won't come out of this alive. But I'm not just gonna like get out of this situation as quickly as I can. I'm gonna act like I'm gonna become like engage in the violence myself, and that happens in X as well. Yeah, with the car at the end.
Yes, It sort of reminds me of Drive in that way, like the elevator scene in Drive.
Oh yeah,
which is like, it's at first it's an act, it's a valiant act in the sort of because the film is essentially like a sort of revisionist western, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like saving her from this would-be assassin. Is initially a valiant act of which is completely in line with the sort of heroic arcs of classic sort of morally black and white Western heroes or archetypes, and then he crushes his head, just stamps on it repeatedly.
That's right,
and that's the moment where you realise that he can never separate himself from the violence. That sort of that will. And I think it reminded me of that scene.
Oh right, okay, yeah, no, that is
in the context
that is true,
of the way
actually.
It sort of plays with archetypes of heroism and how heroes, in a classical sort of Hollywood sense, know where the line is.
Yeah.
They'll do the dirty work, which is always quite funny in westerns because so many fucking cowboys did fucking dreadful things.
Oh,
but
awful,
they'll do the dirty work, but it won't be excessive.
Yeah,
it won't be torturous.
There's always a nobility. about the way it's enacted.
Like the way we. Again, falsely view like knights or samurai,
Yeah, knights were apparently similar in a similar way. Like,
I mean, they
let power get
people
to
below them like shit. The same way samurai did. It's interesting. This is quite a segue, but there's this idea about that which is perpetuated by a lot more sort of more contemporary examples of it. But a lot of sort of older movies like Kurosawa, like a lot of samurais are treated like sort of quite pompous, three-dimensional characters, but there's a sort of pomposity because they've got a higher social rank than...
Okay.
This is a real fucking
No.
but,
I think it leads back to this to MaXXXine a little bit because just in the way that she kind of justifies her behaviour, which turns very quickly from self-defense to just like sickening. Like bloodlust, in
the same way that the driver does in Drive,
and
absolutely. Ultimately he denies himself the sort of happiness that he probably could have had. Because she realises that he is never going to be able to separate from that world. I think it's a really interesting point, actually, Ben. Very good. Should we talk about MaXXXine a little bit?
Yeah, go on then.
So obviously I love X. I really liked Pearl. I was super fucking excited for this movie. I thought, again, the sort of ambiguity in West's approach to sort of his, the films and the genre that he's obviously homaging or leaning into heavily. I thought, well, that in the 80s, give me some of that. Really, I mean, I don't know if he's sort of like paying homage to the sort of neon-drenched excess of the 1980s, but he really does away with that ambiguity.
Oh yeah. I think what I was saying earlier about what he's kind of guilty of is is succumbing to the aesthetic pleasures of it, really, and that kind of ultra grainy. I mean, I know it looks lovely. It looks
a beautiful
like
shot film, yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't do what Pearl does with an era, which is do away with that kind of cliches of the kind of visual cliches. It really embraces it, and it really and it's been done before with other films like Love Lies Bleeding has that touch to it. And
yeah.
I just feel like I'm starting to get a bit sick of it a little bit.
Well, the 80s has been sort of fetishized, hasn't it? You know,
exactly,
like Stranger Things probably really kicked the door in terms of mainstream culture and really sort of having a reverence for the music, the style, the culture more broadly. I agree. I found it it was sort of homage to the point of narrative stagnation. I thought, so many plots and ideas that had sort of obviously linked the era. Obviously you've got the 80s Reagan era hyper capitalist, the sort of the dying embers of hippie culture have been brushed away, and we're sort of going back to this sort of conservatism and the sort of socio-cultural whiplash that gave the 80s, and how the subversion came through sort of indulging in these sort of rock bands and these sort of slasher movies that were viewed by sort of conservatives as this sort of gateway into depravity and hedonism and everything that America apparently in their eyes stood against. It's interesting to hear West talk about his sort of references. There's a few films that he mentions, a couple of which I can't remember which one was called, but it's like a sort of 80s detective drama, I think, in Hollywood. I can't remember what it's called, but I couldn't get hold of it because it was like 30 quid for the Blu-ray, and I was like,
oh man, okay, yeah.
But his reference points are quite interesting. Particularly, have you ever seen the film Hardcore?
Oh,
Schrader, Paul Schrader.
I haven't seen it. No,
so that's like about a very religious chap. I think he's I can't remember what religion is, but it's one of the sort of like sects of Christianity that's quite.
Oh right, a hard line.
Yeah, quite hard line.
Yeah,
and his daughter goes missing, and he goes on this sort of like odyssey through like the sort of this depraved culture of pornography and drug use and all this kind of stuff. And it's this sort of journey that he takes into the sort of darkened soul of America, and it's this sort of idea that his view on the world, his view on that culture plays a role and almost feeds back into it. It's like a feedback loop. Like he's looking at it from this, what he perceives to be these sort of, through this lens that's pure and decent and everything that is good in the world. It's that attitude that's actually stifling and repressive and oppressive and leads people to sort of find these sort of pockets of subversion, or even collapse into sort of sleaze or addiction and all these sort of really horrible things. And it's a fascinating movie. I think it's low-key one of Schrader's best films.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's George C. Scott, the actor.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Fantastic in it. So good. I could go on about that film a lot
Scrooge,
more. Yeah. Great actor.
Yeah.
Again, Schrader just has so many fucking underrated gems that are just sort of like that just never quite hit the heights of other filmmakers of the era.
Right, yeah.
But man, it's so good. And West obviously borrows from that liberally.
Okay, yeah.
The opening.
Okay, yeah.
It's just like I liked the sort of. I really liked the opening of her having the audition.
Yes,
that was great. But all of the stuff about the
Night Stalker,
just all of it, like it was just like fuck. This is so much.
Yeah. I think the inclusion of the Night Stalker was slightly strange. Because it didn't really. I mean, I know the idea is that it's the copycat killer, but I don't know why you needed that. Really, I mean, it was that to me. Correct me if I'm wrong, but to me that just existed to place it further in that era. Yeah, of getting a potential audience members that might have been alive at the time and remembering it to be like, oh yeah, that. I don't think it really needed to be there. I don't know why, because there's archive footage of Richard Ramirez getting kind of. Arrested at the end, and I do remember thinking, because Texas Chainsaw is famously based on Ed Gein, I think his name is, but the way they kind of shoot kind of weave that into the narrative is like quite nice and subtle, and like it's just a kind of a reference point. But here I thought it was like really overt and unnecessary. Yeah.
Speaks more broadly to the film's thematic problems.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean, I wasn't bored, but I wasn't like as entertained. I think, certainly not as with Pearl or X, but it was. It felt a bit, it fell a bit flat at points. I mean, there's some good performances in it. Mia Goth, we already mentioned. Kevin Bacon's like having a lot of fun.
Yeah, with his sort of Chinatown.
Yeah, exactly.
And one of the film's many unsubtle nods to sort of the cinematic history of, particularly American, with the exception, obviously, Giallo films, with the sort of leather glove and jacket clad killer.
Of course. Yeah. There's that as well.
Again, it just felt like, there's so much stuff, reverence for the era, so much reverence for the culture.
Yeah,
a bit of intrigue as to the sort of the sort of dark corners of the American dream, in the city that is the sort of very literal representation of the American dream.
Yeah.
It's they're all vying against each other. All these plot lines that are sort of just sat on top. They're never really woven together.
No,
it all feels quite incongruent, and then it just leaves this feeling that you just think, well, why is that here? Like, what purpose do these things serve other than to go, this is the 80s? Do you like slasher films?
Yeah.
Do you like Giallo films? I don't know, like all of that subtlety that, again, maybe it is to sort of suit the excess of the era, but that still feels a bit cheap.
Yeah. I just think the franchise belongs, like you say, in the wilderness more than the city, really. I think maybe that was actually a bit of a misstep, maybe, in the way it was constructed. Like, I liked the vibe of X, in this kind of like, I know it was made for very cheap, and that's probably the reason why, but it's sort of isolated, it's self-contained, it's easy to explain away why police can't turn up quickly. Same with Pearl. I mean, Pearl there's like a town in Pearl, but I think the city setting is like, I don't know, sort of Jason Takes Manhattan kind of territory of just like, you instantly cheapen it a little bit.
I see where you're coming at. I think I like that he had the confidence to go into the urban setting.
Okay, yeah.
But I think it makes more sense in terms of the trajectory of the character.
Okay, yeah. But her rise to stardom.
Yeah,
I can see that.
See where you're coming at in terms of like, you do limit your sort of, your scope of justifications, I guess, genre-based justifications.
Yeah.
But I'd almost like it. I like that there's this sort of, the idea of, I guess with the Night Stalker, there's that element of it is that, that anyone could be the killer. They're hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
But I just think it all could have been handled a lot better.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know necessarily if the setting is the problem personally for me. The problem for me is just like West's really sort of dizzying excitement in which he approaches setting, historical context, and and homage to all of the films that he really likes.
Yeah, okay, and kind of maybe letting them steer the wheel as opposed to being like having his own ideas and his own input.
It just felt really different, like in terms of like, a total lack of sort of control. It felt like someone that was just drunk on nostalgia for a period of history.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
So much so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think West is. It's not affected my sort of view of him too much. Like, I still quite enjoyed the movie. I didn't dislike it.
Yeah.
I just, when I think about it more in the context of his previous work, that's when I started to think, oh, it wasn't that good. But like, I actually quite enjoyed it on its own.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it is enjoyable. It is
silly fun.
Yeah, it's very silly, and it's quite.
That's what my friend said when I talked to her about it. I was explaining all these grievances. She was like, "Yeah, I get where you're coming from, but like, it doesn't. Maybe that's part of the reason why it is still quite fun."
Okay.
And I thought that's quite a good way to look at it. Really,
it is a lot of fun in at points. There's a really strange moment where It's like a daylight chase. Kevin Bacon's chasing me.
That was crap.
That was really bad. And
So
they end up with the Bates, the like fucking Bates.
What is the point of that? Like, you've just got like one of the most iconic pieces of set, the most iconic set. Sorry, in certainly Hollywood horror history.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth. How do you say her surname?
Debicki.
Is it Debicki?
Yeah.
Her character basically says, well, this is one of the first films that really challenged audiences' sort of moral, really challenged their moral compass.
Yeah.
Well, I thought, okay, so it's like another sort of unsubtle allusion to sort of, the power of horror cinema.
Yeah.
And I thought, right, so you've got that for that moment, and a really crap chase sequence with Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, and that ends,
and then it just goes. And I thought that for me is like a fitting sort of everything. It's sort of like a microcosm for everything else that's wrong with this movie.
Yeah,
you've got something that's like there's potential there, and you've obviously want to use it for something grand, and in your mind it's grand, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't serve the narrative in any meaningful way other than sort of, again, sort of placating the sort of half-baked ideas that you've sort of developed in other plot lines, which are equally as undercooked.
Yeah. There's a lot of that. I mean, the twist is a good example of that as well, of just being kind of coming out of nowhere, being a bit...
I had an inkling it was going to be the dad.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because of the opening.
Oh, yeah.
Which I also thought shouldn't have been in the film.
No, that reminded me of the opening to Us as well.
Oh, right,
a weird opening to that, which kind of just like the Hands Across America thing, and then they come back to it at the end. I was like, okay. Confusing.
Yeah.
I didn't like that twist at all. I didn't even really think it was a twist. I thought it was like a bizarre, like it's just not needed. Really, for me, if narratively, like in terms of writing a screenplay, I'm not a screenwriter, but it didn't do anything for me.
No, the idea, I guess, it's sort of suggest the equally sort of radical and perverse nature of extreme conservatism and religion.
Yeah,
and the inability to see elements of that in this culture that you hate.
Yeah,
it's probably part of the reason why they're so fanatical about getting rid of it.
Yeah.
Which is something that's been sort of discussed quite a lot anyway. And I don't know, like, I just it got a bit sort of religious culty by the end, and I thought, oh, this is just there's a real wave of horror films doing this. Like in part, like. Ari Aster might be slightly responsible for that.
Yeah,
and no, don't get me wrong, I fucking love Midsommar and I really like Hereditary, but this sort of culty religious thing, like, you need to, A24 particularly need to drop it.
Yeah, they do
for a while.
I think it worked in Midsommar because the whole film is about that community, and it gets built up and it's enriched with context, and you kind of with this one you don't get that at all. It's just they appear in hoods. There's a witch burning type thing. Silly. And then the police turn up and there's a pretty not very good gun fight.
That was weird, that. It sort of became like an action movie.
Yeah.
Like a sort of,
The stakes changed like really quickly. And all right.
There's so much going on.
Yeah, and the bit at the end with I quite liked the bit where she says, I will not accept a life I don't deserve. The helicopter kind of thing right at the end.
His face off.
Yeah. But then they didn't do as much. They didn't do what I thought they were going to do with that phrase. Like there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of. I thought she was going to sack it in and not be famous. That was what I thought she was going through at that moment. I thought she was going to reject it in favour of a kind of quiet existence. But she does the exact opposite, which is very, very MaXXXine. But
it's in keeping with the sort of overarching theme of the film or the trilogy.
Yeah, and there's that head, the severed head. What did you think? What did that mean? I didn't quite get that either. It was a bit. I think I was semi-checking the football scores by that moment.
You watched it during the final.
I watched it literally right when Spain were beating England.
Giving us a good fucking Roderick. Maybe this sort of artifice of the genre.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's what I sort of took from it.
Yeah, mate, that makes sense. But she's kind of she sees it as real.
Yeah.
And she sees it as like her kind of.
It's almost like a symbol of making it. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the? There was another bit that really confused me. There's a really naff English accent in it at one point. I can't remember who it was. Someone reasonably famous trying to do like a Yorkshire accent.
She's English though, isn't she, that actress?
Yeah, but she's not from Yorkshire, and you can tell. And that was meant to be her real, like her character's real accent. Is that shot, that scene, like
outside the caravan?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
yeah.
That's just worth a mention as being a bit baffling.
Giancarlo Esposito having a good time though.
Yeah, he was good in it.
I liked his hair.
Yeah.
again, like a sort of a real sort of done a million times sort of thing, like the sleazy agent.
That's it.
But
very loyal.
He had fun with it.
He did,
and I guess maybe if you view the film through that lens, you probably, you don't. If you don't view it through the way we've just spent the last 20 minutes viewing it, if you view it through the fact that everyone just seems to have quite a good fun with it, you'll probably have more fun with it.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I did have a bit more fun with it, but
I did.
I just got quite annoyed with it as well.
I think it's preceded by two very, very good films, which raise the bar too high.
And I think it's acceptable to go in with high standards on the basis of the previous two films.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and given his track record of making good horror films and subversive horror films, but not annoyingly subversive as A24 occasionally sort of stray into sometimes.
Yeah. They're at an interesting juncture, I think, A24.
Yeah,
because for a while I think we sort of blew our beans over them quite a lot in the early days of Cineboys Cinemenas, talking about them as sort of trailblazers, not just for horror but for cinema more broadly. And I still sort of semi hold on to the hope that they are going to continue with their sort of slew of largely great films. But you are starting to see them venture out into sort of more familiar sort of territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they've almost started to become a sort of their own sort of thing, haven't they? There's something like we said about the sort of folk horror element. It's like they seem to be hedging their bets with films that, thematically, narratively, or whatever, are very similar. It's interesting. I'm not being negative about them.
No,
I think this was always going to happen given A24's size and the way in which they've obviously got an audience that is broader than just film fans. And that's inevitably going to happen in the sort of economic way in which these industries go, in the way in which this is a hyper-capitalist industry. And the reality is that they're probably going to end up probably making more stuff that ends up becoming quite familiar.
I feel
hopefully not. That might sound quite cynical.
Well, I mean, it depends on how it goes for them. If that is a bet that pays off. If they do continue to, I don't think MaXXXine's doing tremendously well.
No.
I don't think it's making as much money as they thought it was going to.
I thought they were really hedging their bets. The trailer really had a vibe for it that was like, this is going to fucking kill it.
This is going to be 100+ million.
The trailer was pretty good, I thought.
But you're always going to be... It's weird to consider a film like Longlegs, which I'm quite keen on watching.
Yeah, I tried to watch it yesterday, but... me and my friend went and we couldn't get seats.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, there we go then. I mean, Neon is another company to look out for.
Yeah.
As being an emerging horror kind of underdog.
Yeah.
And A24 were in their position at one point. And
maybe we need to stop thinking about A24 in that way. They're not a fledgling company anymore. They're like a powerhouse. They're like a big studio.
Absolutely, a lot of sort of the layperson would... those without a film degree would know all about them at this point, largely because of things like Midsummer and the surprise hits and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think I'm slightly inclined to revisit MaXXXine. It wasn't very long. It was very gorgeous. It was like a gorgeous film to look at. And the violence is sort of it gives you that payoff, doesn't it?
It does, although it's not as much as invention as...
No, there's one which the aforementioned stomping.
Yeah, that was the best. Yeah, the best bit of violence in the film.
Yeah,
which is a weird thing to say given the context of it, but
but it does sort of it presents you with a kind of taboo busting moment, which I remember really fondly from in X. And one of the reasons I thought it was ultimately very memorable, and it has that power to it. That scene.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
There's a scene where someone gets their throat slashed, which fell a bit more into the kind of giallo, blood spurty.
Type
I
was actually surprised by how, because I'm a bit funny with violence in films these days. It doesn't stop me from watching films, but obviously the context which violence is framed within obviously has a considerable impact. I went to see Kinds of Kindness.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
and,
okay. There's violence in that film, but obviously, given the nature of the film, it's like obviously not overtly a horror movie. It's quite queasy.
Yeah, Dogtooth has that. Well,
it's interesting you say that because Kinds of Kindness feels like a return to that. It's the same writer that he co-wrote Dogtooth with, wrote the script.
Right, okay.
Worth checking out.
Yeah.
I'd definitely say go for it. I have reservations about that one as well. We'll have to discuss that another time. But
I've heard it's had a bit of a polarised reception.
Yeah, 100%. And we'll talk about it maybe another time when we do our end of year review, maybe.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But I was surprised by how I managed the violence quite well.
Yeah.
In X, I was kind of like, fuck. It was kind of like a bit of a thrill ride, and I was a bit like, oh.
Yeah.
So just to my older age, I've just got a bit softer with that kind of violence.
Man, that's totally...
I'll still watch it. Like, I'm not going to not watch the films because of it. But, but I was still surprised. I actually found, like, the more recent Scream film we went to watch more difficult to watch.
Yeah. There's that bit where he's trying to get across the plank of wood from one window to another. Yeah. That bit stood out to me as being really quite gruesome. And really quite like I wouldn't consider like you. I wouldn't really consider myself to be squeamish, but given enough, like anything with teeth or anything with like eyes or like
which X has him.
Yeah. It there's a threshold which can be crossed, which can be used to great effect.
Thinking like the end of Bone Tomahawk.
Oh god, yeah.
That's the extreme end of that, though.
Oh yeah, that's pushing it. Even for me, but like Nightmare on Elm Street has that kind of stuff as well. But like, there's a kind of Warner Brothers cartoony feel about it, which I imagine with something like Kinds of Kindness, which feels very, very much like not a cartoon.
No, it's a strange film.
Okay.
It's like him going back to Dogtooth, but through the lens of all the success he's had.
Okay.
So it's an interesting... There's two forces at play in the film which don't always marry together that well.
Okay, yeah.
And being a triptych as well, there is one story in particular that's really good, and there's one that really suffers from what I said. Okay. I felt anyway.
That's all right, yeah. But like, MaXXXine's violence is pretty gleeful, I thought.
Yeah.
Like, on the whole.
Yeah.
And that can be like, with the shotgun to the head at the end, I was like, all right, you've gone. Yeah, you've gone there, haven't you? You haven't, and that's fine. That is a staple of the trilogy you've built up, and it was kind of
yeah.
I would have liked to have maybe had a bit more of a crescendo in that respect, maybe.
Yeah. When the police are chasing him, and then Michelle Mahonaghan comes out with the cross in her eye. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's right.
But again, just brief flickers.
Peters
there's
out.
There's so much stuff that appears and then just fucks off, with very little sort of meaningful or satisfying resolution.
Yeah,
which I'm not saying every film has to do that, but it's a film that definitely sets out to want to do that. I think so. In that regard, I think it leaves it open to criticism in that area.
Yeah.
Like it, I enjoy it. It's funny. I look at it through two lenses. If I look at the lens of people just having fun, I have fun.
Yeah.
If I look at it in the context of West's other work, which is vastly superior, and what it's done in terms of like its homage to the genre, the eras that the film was set, yada yada yada, it is not that great.
Yeah.
So that's strange. I'd still say it's probably worth a go.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like I need to tell people to temper their expectations a bit, and to just enjoy it as like a kind of roller coaster, as opposed to going in expecting something new, because it isn't anything new. It's actually quite the opposite. Yeah, and that's all I have to really. That's all I have to say about it. Really, I'll probably forget about it quite soon, which is a shame because I won't forget about Pearl or X for a very long time. So yeah. Do another one. Is he going to do another one?
I'd be taking a break. Yeah, I'm interested to know where he goes next, because obviously, he's particularly in MaXXXine, he's flirted with this idea of other genres.
Yeah, absolutely.
I quite see him do like a cop drama.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But just like strip it back, halve your budget.
Give him $1 million, yeah.
Like go
X was $1 million and Pearl was $8 million. The budget for Pearl was like 8 times what X was, and they filmed it right after. So X got shot in 2021. They got pandemicked by, well, COVID, and then so they decided to film Pearl immediately and just get it. And they used like the Avatar Way of Water film crew to do it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So A24 greenlit it before X had even been shot as well. Oh. It's a really strange way of doing the first 2 films.
I admire their confidence in that regard.
Yeah, fair play.
Yeah.
That $1 million film we greenlit. Do you want to do the sequel as well, even before we've seen any of your like?
That is mad.
Yeah. Bizarre, but there we go.
Yeah. Interested to see where A24 go. I saw the had a trailer film with Hugh Grant. You seen that?
Really?
Like these people, I think it's A24, but it's like these sort of people that are religious knocking on doors.
Right, okay.
And they get involved with Hugh Grant, who ends up being this sort of psychopathic individual.
Interesting turn for him.
Yeah, who's out to sort of test their faith through a series of what seems to be like a sort of Saw-like labyrinth.
Right. Could be fun.
Yeah.
I think Hugh Grant is in need of a role like that, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, he's given flashes of it, hasn't he?
Yeah,
Cloud Atlas.
Yeah, God, of course. Yeah. Didn't mind him in Dungeons and Dragons either. I thought it was like quite a fun
I think there's
little
something in there. I think I'd really like to see him go for these kinds of different kinds of roles.
I mean, that speaks to A24's shift into the mainstream, I think, if they're working with him. Or Hugh Grant shift away from the mainstream a little bit as well.
It's interesting when we start thinking about what is mainstream, and I just think in the context of A24's rapid ascension, they are a mainstream studio. Really.
Yeah, I think they should be considered.
I mean, I guess you have to sort of see what the jury's out. Maybe they're going to do what a lot of the established studios do, and pump out the more familiar stuff and then have the sort of more independent projects running parallel to that.
Maybe, yeah. They'll have
perhaps under like a subsidiary company like Fox and Fox Searchlight and all that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah. Called Paramount Vantage.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Nice.
So give it a pop.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Give the other 2 a pop as well.
Oh, 100%. Watch those. I implore you to watch those more.
Yeah. I'd say
watch MaXXXine, if anything, to conclude everything.
Yeah, because it's like a reasonably satisfying end to it.
Yeah.
If not very meandering and slightly confusing at points, but yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
And right. Outro.
Questing the cinematic void. There we have it then. MaXXXine. T West. I always think of Key West, which is like a place in Florida where sort of preppy kids go and party.
There used to be I think it's called Splashdown now, but where I used to live in South Devon, the water park was called Key West.
Was it? Okay.
Never went.
No doubt named after.
Lived there for like 6 years. It's representative of my sort of sedentary and active lifestyle that I never once went to the water park. 5 or 6 years of living there. But Key West. Key West.
I imagine...
Connection?
Maybe.
Possibly.
Yeah. He might be... I think low-key he's promoting it.
Yeah.
As a water park.
Yeah. MaXXXine is rife with water park subtext. It's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
What a shill. Next week,
yes,
Twisters.
Yes,
disaster films. You've had your eye on this for a while.
Yeah. So Hannah is a huge fan of the original Twister. I like it a lot.
I like it too. Yeah.
I remember. It was the film that made me watch The Shining, actually. Because there's a bit in in Twisters where they're watching it on like a sort of drive-through cinema, and then a tornado comes and destroys the cinema screen. And I remember asking my parents what that film was, and like, it's The Shining. You should watch The Shining. And maybe look away at various points. But I owe that to Jan de Bont.
Good old Jan de Bont. Yeah. I like it. I've got a lot of it's a comfort movie. There's something comforting about disaster films, which we'll talk about.
Completely, yeah. And I think the sort of outrageous set pieces in this one, combined with the sort of weird kind of divorce subplot. And just storm chases. It's just an interesting film. Like in terms of visual effects as well, it was quite it was pioneering in terms of how they were, how it was shot and how it kind of changed the pipeline a little bit, which I'll try not to bore you with too much.
Oh no, we love that. We love that here.
I think if possible as well, we'll try and get Hannah on for this one because
I would love that.
Yeah, her opinion on Twister,
husband and wife,
united
absolutely. Over disaster films.
Yeah. So hopefully we can get her on. That'd be really cool.
Oh, that'd be lovely.
Yeah,
I'd love that.
Looking forward to it.
It's doing well.
Yeah.
Interesting that like Glenn Powell's in it, and he seems to be really good at picking sort of just really good, earnest blockbusters like Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah, of course.
I don't know, like there is a real art to a proper blockbuster, which is increasingly difficult to do in the modern landscape of cinema. I think so. Yeah. One that sort of sufficiently harks back to that sort of original feel of what a classic blockbuster used to feel like. And I think he's definitely at the sort of the tip of the spear in that regard with his last couple of efforts.
Definitely, I think I haven't actually seen it, but apparently his latest sort of rom-com was very charming and good.
Oh, the one with
Sydney Sweeney, Anyone But You, I think it's called. Apparently, it's just a very kind of, again, like in terms of revitalising a genre, I think he's your man.
Yeah.
So looking forward to this one. Strangely, I think it's going to struggle to match the spectacle in the sense that in the 90s this kind of technology was emerging and
it was embryonic, wasn't it?
Yeah, but now it's part of the parcel, so I think it's going to need something else to fuel it a little bit, but I'm curious.
Maverick did that though, didn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, we're sort of almost expectant of a certain level of special effects to the point where you have to look elsewhere to pull everything together. Make I guess in that regard, a lot of it was obviously actual fighter jets, wasn't it? So
still a lot of visual effects in it, but hidden, very very subtly deployed, and the stunt work is all real, which is
real tornadoes. Then that's what I'm hearing.
They look real. They don't look real.
No, they don't. No, definitely not.
There's fire in them for a start. Can't happen. Yeah, or maybe it can. I don't know. Hannah can enlighten us about that. She's always watching like a tornado documentary, but to go to sleep. So I don't know why that would be the opposite.
So what I'm hearing is that I don't have to do any research about tornados. I do a lot of fucking research anyway. But
usually you'd be up all night.
Yeah.
With
like my sort of one of the walls in our bedroom just covered with like a sort of like a detective tracking a serial killer. Really looking forward to that.
Nice. Yeah, me too.
Let's do it.
Cool.
Not now, obviously later.
No,
in the meantime, thank you as always, and catch you later.
See you in a bit.
Bye.
Bye.